Canada's finance minister jolts the nation as he announces the country's largest deficit since World War II. In the States, international students are told they may have to go home, while here in Canada, students face their own challenges. Humber journalism traveled to Uganda earlier this year to document efforts to reduce violence against children. We'll showcase their work coming up. Humber News starts now.
Hello, I'm Sewon Huang, coming to you with a virtual newscast from Humber College. It's Thursday, July 9th. Here's what's making news. The federal government has released its economic snapshot showing just how much a shock COVID-19 has been to our economy.
Pursuant to order made on Tuesday, May 20th.
An unprecedented level of spending was the message from the federal government. The forecast was a jaw-dropping deficit of more than $343 billion. This is 10 times last year's deficit of $34 billion. Canada has not seen this level of spending since World War II. This massive increase in spending is expected to push the national debt past $1 trillion. COVID-19 is the reason for this excessive spending.
Our government has understood from the moment this pandemic began that it was our role to step in to support Canadians and stabilize the economy. The COVID-19 Economic Response Plan is the most comprehensive and substantial peacetime investment in Canada's history, representing more than $212 billion in direct support and nearly 14% of GDP in total support.
That support was much needed as more than 5 million Canadians, about one-third of the country's workforce, have lost their jobs or saw their work hours reduced due to COVID-19. But this may not be the worst of it. Should a second wave of COVID-19 hit Canada, the country's spending could rise even higher.
3 of the 5 countries with the highest COVID-19 infection rates are in North and South America. The United States, Brazil, and Peru now have more than 5 million cases combined.
As of this week, the cases in the U.S. have hit more than 3 million. Despite this, gathering places like Florida's Disney parks are set to open this weekend. Texas saw 2 record highs this week, the highest rate of positive COVID tests, and the largest number of deaths in a single day, 100. In Brazil, more than 1.6 million are now infected, making it the second highest infection rate in the world. Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, has tested positive for COVID-19. He made journalists aware earlier this week after removing his mask. Peru's COVID-19 cases have now surpassed 300,000 people. Still, the South American country has lifted lockdown restrictions after 3.5 months and has allowed some businesses to restart operations.
A cleaner environment may have emerged as a silver lining in this ongoing pandemic, but experts say any positive changes are likely just temporary. Shruti Mehra has the report.
Many parts of the world are witnessing an evident drop in the pollution levels due to a halt in the activities during ongoing COVID-19. But experts emphasize on the need to have more permanent solutions for climate change.
It's good that air pollution is decreasing temporarily, and a lot of species are coming out of the woodwork and rebounding. In order to make these changes and improvements permanent, we need to change the fabric of our society and how we operate. And the way to do that is usually through strong government policy. So if we can't expect that these improvements and reductions in air pollution and species coming back are going to stick around if we don't take strong action to make those changes permanent.
A climate change research organization, Integrated Carbon Observation System, shares the change of CO2 emission due to post-COVID-19 confinements. The emissions in individual countries on an average has decreased by minus 26%.
I don't think COVID is helping anyone, but I think that it has given us a window into a pathway to reducing emissions or having cleaner air, and has shown that it is possible to have those things. But the way that we get to those environmental benefits should be a different and more permanent pathway.
Experts are expecting to experience change in the consumer behavior as people are getting used to their lockdown routines.
Moving forward, it's a great time to think about, okay, what can we not go back to that we don't need to necessarily do the same way. And if you take the example of working from home, there are lots of people like me who, I worked in an office every day, and now me and my colleagues are thinking, do we need to go into an office every single day and take, cars or transit or even, a bike to go in and do that?
The upcoming actions and economic policies of the government post-crisis will likely to influence the global climate. Experts forecast that if some restrictions remain worldwide until the end of this year, the carbon emissions will drop even further. I am Shruti Mehra for Humber News.
Close to home, Ontario this week recorded the highest number of new COVID-19 cases since the end of June, most of them from the Windsor-Essex region. Meanwhile, Premier Doug Ford announced a new bill that could extend emergency measures for up to a year.
The province's state of emergency was supposed to expire next week on July 15th, but the introduction of the new legislation means the government will be able to extend or amend some emergency orders a month at a time if necessary.
Our government is bringing forward legislation that would allow us to lift the provincial declaration of emergency in the very near future, while continuing to give our frontline healthcare providers the tools and powers they need to keep us safe.
The new legislation would give the province the power to amend workplace rules, restrict gatherings, and roll back economic stages in the event of future outbreaks.
The Ontario government has also announced a new funding to provide opportunities to 43 youth organizations. Kajal Pavar has a story.
These grassroots organizations are making a real impact in their communities and supporting our next generation of leaders. We will continue to remove the barriers to success for our young people, so each and every
The Ontario government has announced $13 million in investments to support youth organizations. The funding is aimed to help collaborative projects by Black or Indigenous-led community groups. Organizational mentors like the Neighborhood Group help these grassroots institutions in receiving the funding.
What we do is we really want to leverage the sector in allowing these young people to gain access to resources that, one, they don't currently have access to, and two, being able to mentor them and support them in their own personal growth as young leaders of the community.
Black Women in Motion is one of the programs that has received funding under the mentorship of the Neighborhood Group. The program promotes economic resiliency and independence for Black youth. For Humber News, I'm Kajal Pavar.
A video of a woman attacking Black Lives Matter protesters in Winnipeg has gone viral this week.
Theo Landry and his friend were peacefully protesting when a woman stepped out of her car and attacked them with a hockey stick. She continues to abuse them after the protesters try to stop her, which can be heard in the video.
I was very much scared for my life because I didn't know, as they all got out of the car, I didn't know. I'm lucky it was a hockey stick because I didn't know what they could have came out with.
The incident happened after a rally for Black and Indigenous lives at the Manitoba legislature. Protests have been ongoing in the province for the last several weeks.
The Ontario government says it will put an end to dividing high school students into separate streams of either academic or applied learning to make the education system more inclusive, accountable, and transparent. Anukul Thakur has that story.
You're asking a 14-year-old child to make a decision in grade 9 where the rest of their high school career and post-secondary schools that they're going to. And I just don't think it's right. It's a broken system.
The province says it will stop the practice of academic streaming in grade 9 after years of calls from educators and advocacy groups to do so. Experts say having to choose either an academic or applied track at the start of high school disproportionately limits Black and low-income students from future opportunities.
We seem to be streaming certain kinds of students into applied, and also then by doing that, we're setting them up for failure.
A People for Education report in 2015 found that students in applied courses were much less likely to go to university, and a 2017 report by York University found that Black students in the GTA are far more often streamed into applied courses than other students.
If you go into applied in grade 9, you're way less likely to do well than if you go into academic. And that's whether or not you've struggled in the years before.
Kida says the province has so far provided no details as to what would replace the streaming model.
Suddenly you get an announcement in a newspaper with nothing to back it up. There's no press release, there's no policy document. And it is worrying right now, and it's worrying in a time of COVID where there are a lot of other things going on, that we don't seem to have from the provincial government a comprehensive plan.
The Provincial Education Ministry says a full plan to eliminate streaming will be shared soon and will be implemented next year. Anukul Thakur, Humber News.
South of the border, Immigration and Customs has announced that international students pursuing degrees in the U.S. will have to return to their home countries or risk deportation if their schools move to online-only classes. The announcement was a surprise to many. It's unclear how Canadian students in the U.S. will be affected. International students here at Humber and throughout Canada face their own challenges as they endure pandemic restrictions. Humber's Kajal Pavar visited several in the capital.
In the shared student house in Ottawa, a number of international students lean on each other for support through mounting challenges through the COVID-19 crisis.
Especially with so much happening around and spending so much resources and being emotionally away from the family, it becomes hard sometimes, and especially coming from a country whose currency is way lower compared to Canada, it becomes financially difficult. I pray to God every day that things become better and we have face-to-face classes real soon.
The wait for face-to-face classes may be a long way off, but there's added pressure for many who are also waiting to return to work and the much-needed income to support themselves in Canada.
So currently I'm not working. I'm not sure whether they're going to pay me or they're going to call me back to work again. And they haven't laid me off, so it's really critical situation.
For international students, life has become a series of doing chores on repeat, missing home and wondering when will this end. I'm Kajal Pavar for Humber News.
Some other countries have already begun reopening their post-secondary institutions and inviting international students back. Humber News reporter Harmony Multani checks in with a Canadian student under quarantine on her return to studies at Cambridge University in the UK.
For Canadian PhD student Alice Kelly, returning to her studies at Cambridge has meant 14 days in quarantine, and that has made for some very long days.
This is a very unique circumstance, and there's not a ton of students that have been told they're allowed to come back yet. So I'm one of the first students that have been under quarantine. So I think it's been an experience for them as well for me.
That experience includes not being able to leave her university dorm room.
So this is pretty much the room. So my bed, and then kind of like a little sitting area. The window, there has been occasions where I just stick my head outside of that window. So they have been bringing me one hot meal a day from Monday to Friday, and then I can order food and they'll deliver it outside my door, and then I just go outside my door and get the food. And then I keep all my garbage in the room with me. So that's been interesting.
Kelly's PhD research in microbiology and genetics requires a lot of time spent in the lab. After receiving a notification in June, she returned to Cambridge and says her department has already notified students of personal protective measures in place.
So I'm in the Department of Genetics, and what our department has been doing is allocating slot times. So the building is only going to be at 30% capacity at any one time. And luckily, we're in a department where a lot of people work on their computer, so they can work from home. And if you do need to go into lab, you go during your slots.
Kelly says one of the biggest challenges in isolation is having something to look forward to each day. Chats with family and online yoga sessions have been helping her pass the time.
In some ways, it's been harder than I thought, and in many ways, it's a lot easier than I thought. However, I also know I'm surrounded by electronics, and so it's going to be different for people wherever they are. I've been pretty lucky with what I have access to.
Kelly says priorities for when she makes it to the other side is getting back into the lab and doing some outdoor running. Humber News, I'm Harmony Multani.
While under the global pandemic, international travel may seem like a thing of the past. Earlier this year, a team from Humber News traveled to Africa to document efforts to reduce violence against children in Uganda. Reporter Lucy Lau and producer Harmony Multani shared this short documentary.
We are coming here to talk about our rights, and we are also coming to talk about different forms of violence against children. All right? What are some of the different forms of violence against children that you know?
Child kidnap.
Child kidnap. All right? Child kidnap. Rape.
In a classroom in northwestern Uganda, students are drawing their experiences with violence. The pictures are emotional and tough to see in some cases. But it's an exercise that illustrates the impact of childhood abuse, much of which happens at home and in schools.
What about at home? Yes. Overbeating. All right? Overbeating from home. Making children to overwork. So in as far as violence against children is concerned, the school play a lot of role in educating the child on the various forms of violence against children, and also to let the children know whom they can report to in case of an abuse.
You know, there is a say here in Africa that our children learn when they are beaten, which is a very wrong concept. You know, the government of Uganda is actually against this. And we in public schools particularly have been barred from practicing this kind of habit.
While Uganda passed the Children Act, which bans corporal punishment in schools in 2015, violence against children is still an issue across the country. The Uganda government recognizes this and is committed to ending childhood abuse by signing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and becoming a pathfinding country in the global partnership to end violence against children.
UNICEF conducted its first household survey on violence against children in Uganda in 2018. It found that 3 out of 4 young adults reported experiencing some form of violence during childhood. The UN definition of violence includes sexual, physical, and emotional abuse.
That same report found violence against children in Uganda is enabled by harmful practices like early marriage and child labor. Physical punishment is also widely accepted as a form of discipline, leading to psychological and developmental issues, and a cycle of violence where victims become perpetrators themselves.
When children grow with violence, of course you know that in future these children are going to be wild. They will be violent to people as well, because that's what they have grown with, and they think that it is normal because that's what they have gone through. So that's what the government and in a number of institutions are trying to address, but it's a huge problem. It's not easy. It's not easy.
The task of ending violence against children in Uganda has been taken up by local and international initiatives. Some tackle the issue on the front lines, like global training programs that work with the next generation of nurses and childcare workers.
The child in the school who is afraid of being hit by the teacher, it gets a little turbulence, and they're kind of being aware all the time because is it happening or not? So they get frightened and they get mobilization because they have to be quick to go on survival strategies if something bad is happening. And if it's bad, then they kind of get into this alarm. So this is what we call also the fight and flight survival skills.
These programs aim not only to break tradition, but to encourage the exchange of resources and knowledge.
We see the Ugandans as being the experts. What we can do is help support some of the initiatives that they feel are important and help them to develop teaching and learning materials that they can use in the community setting, in the university setting, wherever, focusing upon different target groups. And we're going to make all the resources available.
And we used to hit children because we wanted them to learn, yeah? But the research shows that it decreases.
We who are part of the communities have to go in and spread out these messages. So sharing it reminds us every time of how to get back to our communities and maybe even encouraging us to get better ways of solving these issues.
Dr. Kandia's name means trouble in Lugbara, a name he says he was given because he was born during times of conflict in Uganda. The country is known as the Pearl of Africa because of its lush beauty and biodiversity. But its people have overcome a colonial past, harsh dictatorships, and brutal insurgencies. That trauma has inspired a humanitarian streak. Uganda has participated in UN peacekeeping missions since the 90s, even training with British troops in recent years to help fight extremists in Somalia. It's also home to 1.3 million refugees, making it the world's third largest refugee hosting nation. Many of them come from neighboring countries like South Sudan, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They live on settlements like these, where they bring their own experiences of violence that contribute to Uganda's rate of childhood abuse. Mpevi Refugee Settlement opened in 2017 and is one of Uganda's newest, but it's nearing capacity in only 3 years and now houses more than 120,000 newcomers.
So a lot of these populations have really not experienced peace in their homes, and that translates into the kind of violence that we see amongst the children. So they take it as a norm, and this is seen even from the refugee population that we have in these locations, because of the entire refugee population which is in Uganda. The majority of them are children and women.
A survey of Changwali refugee settlement conducted by Internews Uganda in 2018 found sexual and gender-based violence often goes unchecked at the site, with only 4 of 10 cases reported every week. Violence against children at refugee settlements is worsened by issues related to stress and poverty. According to the UNCHR, these cases are also underreported.
A very good morning. It is on 9 a.m. and from wherever you're tuned in, it is time for the news. I'm Jacqueline Kampindo. Let's look at the details.
To help combat violence on settlements, Internews Uganda partners with local media like Spice FM, a radio station in the western city of Hoima.
Intend to solve this challenge.
The partnership allows journalists to deliver news and resources through a reliable communication channel, which advocates say is key to empowering survivors of abuse.
Our main target was bridging the information gap as well as enabling the refugees and the host community have access to information, because information is very vital. It is just like food, just like shelter, just like clothing. That is information. It is also very vital to a human being.
Spice FM has become a radio of choice to listen to for all refugees in Changwali refugee settlement, because they have identified a radio station that they can relate to. It plays their music, it talks to them in their languages.
Other initiatives that protect kids against abuse include workshops with new mothers, where they may learn to bring up children without violence. Efforts like these point to a brighter future for Uganda's children, one where they're protected against all forms of mistreatment and empowered to speak out against abuse.
it's important that we educate children about human rights so that they know their rights, they also know their responsibilities, and so that if one person abuses the right of a child is able to report that his or her right has been abused.
In fact, that's already happening in some classrooms across Uganda.
Do you know your rights? Yes. One?
Right to education.
You talk loud.
Right to education.
Right to education. Any other?
A right to eat food.
Right to eat food. Any other? Yes. Right to play.
Building on global strategies developed by the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Protection, that's one of many recommendations made by the UN for ending violence against children, giving kids the tools they need to recognize and report abuse.
That's all for today. I'm Sewon Huang. Humber News is written and produced by students in the journalism program. For more coverage, visit our website humbernews.ca and follow us on Twitter at HumberJRNL. We'll see you again next week.